All right. Task 4 for the elementary edTPA.
With our special guest, Cassie, because she's the only elementary ed person here worried about it. Okay, let's see. Is my connection okay? Are you guys hearing me? Because you're pausing and things, so just let me know if you need to repeat something.
I think you sound good.
Let's see. Okay. Let's hope my presentation's good too. Okay, Cassie, what I'm mostly going to do, and if you're recording this, then I'll go over the task. Basically, you read through it. What I'm basically going to do is talk about what you should be including in your commentary that's going to help you get the points, but also describe your work in a way that will demonstrate that you know what you're doing, basically. So like the first 3 tasks with ELA, you went through each component of the curriculum planning and teaching and assessment cycle. You created your learning segment with your lesson plans in task 1, and you commented on that. Then the next task, task 2, you taught it, you recorded yourself, you did your instruction, then you commented on that. Then in task 3, you did an assessment analysis, you reflected on the student's work, you picked one, and then you commented on that, right? And then you talked about what you would do next steps from there, all toward your one central focus for your literacy strategies. So for math, task 4, it's basically all of that except we're only focused on the assessment portion, okay? So you write a learning segment, 3 to 5 lesson plans, all geared toward a conceptual focus or a central focus. Your central focus, as I've mentioned before, should include all 3 parts of what we teach in math, right? Conceptual understanding, procedural knowledge, and mathematical reasoning. So that's what your central focus should be. And then you teach it. You teach your learning segment to your students. And somewhere in that learning segment, you select one formative assessment that you're going to focus on, okay? And the handbook does say formative assessment. Okay, so that means one that was within the lesson, right? Where it wasn't like the big summative assessment at the end. You're focused on that one where you're checking for understanding while you're teaching, not at the end. So that's what you've done. You already wrote your segment, you taught the lessons, you already did the assessments, and that's great. And then you're going back and you're looking at one assessment, and you're going to take that out and you're going to examine it, okay? So that's like the beginning, right? That's everything that you've done up to here. If you're working with younger students and it was more of an, maybe a verbal assessment where you ask students to explain things, maybe you had manipulatives there, or they did something where you were watching them and you have to record that. You could upload that as your assessment as a video or an audio clip and respond to that throughout your commentary. You just have to describe the time, like include the timestamp of your video or audio so the scorers can see what you're talking about. But otherwise, your artifact is the written assessment, right? The student's work. Okay, so let's see. What do I need to think about? How will you analyze whole class evidence to identify patterns of learning? Okay, so assessment analysis means we want to look at how well students are understanding what we're teaching or how well we are teaching. How you will use student work to analyze mathematical errors, confusion, and partial understandings. Okay. You will re-engage students in learning to address identified areas of challenge or need. So we'll talk about that. And then the last thing, how do you use evidence of student learning to reflect on the effectiveness of your re-engagement lesson? Okay, so those are the things you're thinking about. And if you remember, Cassie, we did this in our assessment analysis assignment so many years ago, seems like. But that one assignment that we did in class, I went through it pretty thoroughly in terms of how you should organize your student work, or organize scores, put together in a table or a chart, the quantitative data, and then describing it in a narrative form. So that's, if you still have that work, Cassie, and other people who've had me, then that's something that you can look to and hopefully help you work through this process here. Okay, so you selected your class in terms of what you needed to do. Remember, for this task, you have to provide that content for learning information, and then the things I talked about. So you also need to do a context for learning for this part. Okay, how do I scroll down? Is the video that you see, is it moving with when I scroll down? Okay. Okay, so let's see, then we will analyze student work. So you did all that, and now you're going to analyze student work. So the interesting thing here that has changed from the past handbooks is that it says develop or adapt a formative assessment, because a lot of schools have had our student teachers use a curriculum that they're following. And so our students haven't always had the ability to create their own assessments. So it's nice to see that they say to adapt a formative assessment, because a teacher might say, you're still using this, you still need to use this curriculum. Here are the formative assessments. They might give it all to you, but it's up to you to adapt it in a way that's going to help your students, because it's always important to know your students, right? And it's always important to adjust those assessments so that it fits their needs and not just going by an objective curriculum. So again, you have your conceptual understanding, your computational and procedural fluency, and your mathematical reason and problem solving skills. And when you submit this formative assessment, remember you want to submit a blank copy. Okay, so you will have your students' work, but you also need that blank copy to upload just in like the end of your work here. So you're going to upload a blank copy, and you're going to define the evaluation criteria. So for your lesson plan of the assessment that you're using, you will describe those learning objectives. So I don't know if you remember, Cassie, but when we did our assessment analysis, we had those test packets, or those packets, or that test, and then I had you guys come up with the learning objectives that you thought it was, and then we analyzed which item on the assessment went with which learning objective. And so we specifically said, like, assessment number 1, 2, 3, and 4 all work towards learning objective 1, and that focused on the conceptual understanding, right? Assessment items 4, 5, and 6, those were aligned with learning objective 2, and learning objective 2 focused on the procedural fluency. Items 6, 7, and 8, those focused on procedural fluency, which was learning objective 3. So describing and defining your criteria, your evaluation criteria, is that it's connecting those test items that you have directly to your learning objectives of that lesson plan, and then connecting it to your central focus of your entire segment, okay? So that you see where those test items fit directly into your learning segment, okay? So that's how you define your criteria there. Then you collect and analyze student work. You select and submit 3 work samples. Okay, so you're going to look at all your students' work from that formative assessment, and you're going to include it all in the analysis, meaning the quantitative analysis where you put it into a nice chart that probably demonstrates the test item, shows the test item, shows the student's proficiency on it, shows how it's connected to the learning objectives. So all that important information is in this nice graph or chart that's easily accessible to the scorer to see what students were doing in there. And then your qualitative analysis would be the description of what's going on in there, right? So you do that for all your students, but when it comes to what you submit in terms of student work, you're only focused on those 3 work samples, okay? So as you see there in that last point before re-engaging students in learning mathematics, you see that it says select and submit 3 work samples that demonstrate an area of struggle identified in your analysis, and analyze the errors or misconceptions related to the struggle. So they like to see samples from different ranges in your class. So you might have students who are scoring on the higher end and doing well on this assessment, and have few problems, but maybe there's something that caught your attention with those students. So you're going to select 1 sample there, and you're going to include that, and you're going to describe that. And they also like to see like a student sample that represents kind of the majority of the issues that most of the students had. And so you're going to identify that work sample, and you're going to talk through that. And then they also like to see a student with special needs, or it could be a student who is having some sort of trouble already, and well, anyways, a student with needs. And so you're going to use that student sort of as the representative of how you worked with that group of students. Okay. So those are the 3 samples that you want to include. That's up to you to choose who you want to include there. Okay. Any questions so far?
So if I'm doing specifically special ed and I'm only focusing on 1 student, would you suggest taking, and I'm doing literacy, would you suggest taking from a specific formative assessment? Like, would you suggest for this part taking from a formative assessment that I might have done at the end?
Are you doing the special ed edTPA? Or are you doing the elementary ed one? Oh, I'd have to look at that because it is a little bit different, and I know it's specific to the needs of their goals.
Mm-hmm.
So it is really different from this. I would think that's up to you to choose. Just select one that makes this commentary easy to do. One
Mm-hmm.
that you see how you can talk about those things. But I need to see I need to have a little refresher on what the special ed edTPA asks for. Rebecca, did you have any comments on that? You're muted.
I'm not as familiar with the special ed tasks, so yeah, I don't think I could add anything more than you already said.
Yeah, I would just say find one of the assessments in there that is easy, that makes this easy for you to talk about. I'll have to look at the special ed one if you want me to.
Okay, thank you.
I just quickly, because I have it up, the special ed one doesn't have a task 4, so it is more similar to the secondary, so it has 3 tasks.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it would be okay for task 3. It would be okay to use an assessment at the end of the learning, summative assessment. But what Dr. Kulago is describing about the analysis, even though with task 4 she's talking about a formative assessment, it's still the same kind of analysis where it maps onto the learning objectives. So just to answer your question about would it be okay to use something at the end of the learning, a summative assessment, rather than the formative assessments she's talking about, it does look like for the special ed one that would be okay. But
Okay.
how she's analyzing it here, even though she's talking about a formative assessment, that analysis is the same.
Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to continue with this math one, or do we want to look at the special ed one for Cassie? You're muted still. You're muted.
I had promised a video about the task 4. So
Okay.
maybe if we, because I think a lot of the things that you're going to talk about in the rubrics and stuff are the same for what Cassie's doing with her special ed TPA. So I think it'll be okay. You just want to make sure and look at your rubrics, Cassie, just to see any little bit of difference, but the same kind of analysis is going to go into it.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Let's see. Okay, so again, work samples are important to demonstrate those patterns that you're seeing. The 3 work samples are representing those various groups that you have in your class. Once you do the analysis, you will then move on to re-engaging the students in those learning objectives that you saw they were having trouble with. So after your analysis, you're going to have these conclusions that say students seem to understand this differently, or in a wrong way, or they're having misconceptions here, they struggled here, they had errors here, whatever it was. You're going to link it back to those learning objectives, and you're going to re-engage them in a lesson. So you'll target those learning objectives. You'll design a re-engagement lesson with those learning objectives, and you'll include instructional strategies that you think are going to help. So you just don't want to repeat the lesson plan that you just did or give them more practice problems. You want to re-engage their thinking in another way. So there might be one-on-one, small group, a use of different type of manipulatives, whatever it might be. And then you're going to collect and submit the 3 focus students work samples again, and you're going to describe what happened there. So as you see there, it says you may submit text files or scanned or oral assessments. So whichever it is, again, you can upload those. And then you're going to evaluate the effectiveness of the re-engagement lesson. Okay, so what impact did it have? Hopefully, you know, it worked. The students met the learning objective in a way that you thought they didn't in the previous lesson. And then you talk about that. Okay, let's see. What do I need to write? This is the fun part, the commentary. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so the most important things you're writing about here, of course, your context for learning. And then you're providing the learning segment overview that we've done in my class before. And there's also a copy at the end. And then you have your re-engagement lesson. And then you have your commentary. So again, like I mentioned, you're going through the whole cycle, right? You write your learning segment, you teach it, you have your assessments, and that's what we're focused on. Let me just pull up the learning segment overview, because that's important to talk about. This is the context for learning, just like you did for the other tasks. Okay, this learning segment overview is an overview of that math learning segment that you did. So you have your central focus here, you have your standards to show that they align, and then this is just a quick outline of your learning segment. So you include your learning objectives for lesson 1, you include your instructional strategies and learning tasks. So you don't have to write out everything that you have in your lesson plan, especially if you're writing really good detailed lesson plans where it says teacher will say, teacher will pause, all those good things. But these are mostly your instructional strategies that are going to show alignment with your learning objectives. And then you're including the assessments in this third column, but write them in there in a way that show alignment with your instructional strategies and your learning objectives. Okay, so you always want to demonstrate that alignment there. So if your learning objectives, you know, you spell out that students will be able to, or the students will find the area of triangles or something like that. Your instructional strategies should say something about how you're engaging students to find area of triangle rather than students will work with manipulatives. Okay, that's too general. Students will, teacher will do a presentation. That's way too general. Okay, so make sure you write in there how students will engage with area of triangles. So students will use graph paper. I don't know, I can't think about it right now. So anyway, be specific there in a way that aligns. Don't list everything, but you want it to align is the point, okay? And then your formative assessments should align with that. So however many learning lesson plans it takes, that's what you'll put there, okay. So that learning segment overview is very important for the scorer to know what your learning segment was about and how this assessment that you're analyzing fits into that bigger picture. Okay, so mathematics assessment commentary. It says analyzing student learning with the whole class. Okay, the whole class, like I said, you want to include all the work in your analysis, even though you're only submitting 3 work samples. Okay, so first it says identify the specific learning objectives measured by the formative assessment, provide a graphic, chart or table, or narrative that summarizes student learning for the whole class. Be sure to summarize student learning for all evaluation criteria submitted in mathematics assessment task 4 part B. So this seems like a really simple commentary, but this is the most important part because you want to make sure you have the learning objectives and you describe those, because once you get into your providing a chart or narrative, you're going to describe how your students worked toward those specific learning objectives. And if you look at the first rubric after this section, they have to align. You're going to get a 1 if those things don't even align in the first place. And that's why I say alignment is so crucial, because you could write everything out after that, but if there's no alignment there, then you're going to get 1. You're going to get a score of 1. So make sure that's all aligned. And then here in 1B, it says provide a graphic or narrative. And what we have been saying and what is important is that you do both, okay? if you were in my class, I had you do a chart or a table that included that quantitative analysis. And then I also asked you to describe it in narrative form, because that's going to help the scorer understand what you're talking about, because you have all that data there that's easily viewable. And if the scorer could understand what's happening there, great, but really the narrative is helpful too. And then it says, using examples from the summary chart, discuss the patterns of learning across the whole class relative to. So this is where that narrative comes in really important. You want to have the chart, but also you're describing everything that's happening with the students, the patterns that you're seeing in terms of the learning objectives that you talked about. And that's why it's important to include all three parts of what we teach in math, because it gives you something to write about, and that's what you should be teaching anyway, and that's what the scores are looking for, okay? So make sure you include all of those parts. And that aligns with rubric 16. So rubric 16 is asking, how does the candidate analyze whole class evidence to identify patterns of student learning? Okay, so you put together your quantitative analysis and your qualitative, and now you're describing, and these are the things that the scores are looking for. You want to look for, it says candidate identifies what students did right and wrong. Okay, I'm not even looking at level 2 here, because we don't want to even think about getting a level 1 or a level 2. These are the things that you shouldn't be doing, right? You should make sure it's aligned, and you should make sure what you're teaching is accurate, which, you know, shouldn't be an issue. You also shouldn't just be looking at right or wrong. You should be looking at what students did right and wrong. And you also should be looking at all three components of that lesson plan and those learning objectives. So when you look for students, don't just talk about in your narrative, or don't just highlight in your chart the things that students did wrong or right, okay? So make sure you show both, and then you talk about both. And you're talking about all three learning objectives. You also want to identify, it says here, explicitly connects patterns of learning to. So how are those patterns of learning that you're seeing connected to those learning objectives? So for example, if you see that in the test items that align with the learning objective that is focused on the conceptual understandings, and then you see, you know, the students understanding that, and then you see in the procedural understandings where it might not have graphics or some kind of picture that maybe the students worked on in the conceptual understanding, and now they're just focused on the procedural, and you see errors in the procedural, but you don't see errors in the conceptual. What is that telling you about how students are maybe having some sort of error or misconception about the procedure, even though you can see they understand the concept? So you're making those connections and you're explicitly describing. So you might describe that the majority of the students did well on the conceptual understanding. They were able to identify, they were able to find the area of triangles on the pictures that were shown, whatever it is you want to describe the test item. But in the procedural, in the test item after that, the procedural errors seem to have come from, and then you describe what that misconception was. And then maybe in the problem solving, you saw that the students were, you know, they were doing okay. They did well on that because they understood the concept, but there's something happening in that procedural part that the students aren't quite making that connection. So you're going to describe that. So you're describing how those patterns are showing you what the students are understanding or not, and how it's connected. It's also describing to you what you might have done in that period you were teaching that led the students to those misunderstandings. So you're talking about all those patterns that are happening, okay? And then that will get you to a 4 when you're making those connections between the ways students are performing those patterns, the way they're performing on the different test items. And then level 5, for a score of 5, it says candidate describes the relationship between or among patterns of learning. Oh, I guess that's what I just described. So the more detail you put in to the way that students are understanding certain things and might be having trouble with certain things, that's all connected, right? And so where you see those disconnects, that's where you want to focus and talk about that and explain that thoroughly. And that'll help you, you know, bump up your score there. Any questions? Okay. So the next one, it says analyzing student learning on the 3 focus students. Okay, so 1, you focus on the whole class. 2 here, we're focused on the 3 students. And you want to identify 1 area where students struggled mathematically. Select 3 student work samples that represent the struggles in this area. These students will be your focus students for this task. At least 1 of the focus students must have specific learning needs. So for example, a student with IEP or 504 plan or an English language learner, struggling reader, underperforming, etc. So in what form did you submit your work samples for the 3 students? So that part's pretty simple. B says, analyze the 3 students' work samples and describe the students' struggles as they relate to the underlying mathematical understanding and or concept. Cite specific evidence from the work samples in relation to mathematical errors, confusion, and partial understandings. So as it says here in this highlighted section, it says, what do the errors tell you about their mathematical understanding? You're looking at one issue that you found in all 3 of those samples, right? So it might be all focused on that procedural knowledge again. So maybe they were doing well on the conceptual, they were doing well on the problem solving, but now it's that procedural where something is happening and you saw it in that pattern. And now you're using these 3 work samples, these 3 samples to help you explain it a little more in depth, okay? So that one specific problem. And then you're going to describe what it tells you about their mathematical understanding. It says, for example, if a student error occurs in a subtraction problem, then the underlying mathematical understanding may include regrouping, meaning of subtraction and or subtraction as the inverse of addition. The related mathematical understanding becomes the basis for the targeted learning objective goal for the students. So you're going to think through how the students were misunderstanding, right? So with the student with special needs, there might be a specific way you're going to describe that based on their work, right? And as it says here, cite specific evidence from the work samples. So that means you specifically say, in student 1's work, we see that this is how the student did the work, and this is what I can say about that. And then you go on to the next one, student 2's work. They also had issues with this particular problem or learning objective because of the way they responded to questions 2 and 3. And this is how they misunderstood it, right? And then student work sample 3 also had trouble, but in a different way. And this is what happened here, right? So you see that pattern amongst all of them, but you're using these specific students to describe how they might have done it differently, or maybe if they're all the same, that's interesting too, right? Because there's something happening with all of them and something that was missed, or something that of course the teacher did because you're the one in charge of it. That's going to help you describe this and write your conclusions about that. Okay. C says, if a video or audio work sample occurs in a group context, like in a discussion, provide the name of the clip and clearly describe how the scorer can identify the focus students. So if you use a video, you're going to have to describe the students in some way. So you might mark the timestamp in there. Student 1 starts speaking at 1 minute and 30 seconds into the clip. And then student 2 starts speaking at, so you have to identify them in some way if you use a video clip. Okay. Let's see. So rubric 17 aligns with that commentary prompt. So it says, how does the candidate use student work to analyze mathematical errors, confusion, and partial understandings? Of course, we don't even want to worry about level 1 and 2, but we'll read through them. It says level 1, the analysis is not supported by student work samples. So if your work samples that you're using don't even demonstrate what you're talking about, then that's a level 1. Level 2, candidate selects student work samples that are loosely connected to the struggles. So it might, kind of say it, but you don't want to worry about 2. You want to make sure that you use evidence from the 3 focus students' work samples and identify specific struggles. That's level 3. So make sure that you're using specific struggles from within that work sample to demonstrate what you're talking about. And that's why it says to cite specific work. So you have the students' samples included that you're uploading, and you're going to go and specifically say, if you look at student 1's work sample in assessment item number 5, you see that the student did blah, 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 right? That's specifically citing where the scorer should look to see what you're talking about, okay? So that's what level 3, that's where we start. Okay, you want to make sure you're talking about those actual things that the scorer can go and see, and you're describing that to them, okay? Level 4 says candidate uses evidence from the 3 focus students to explain the student struggles in relation to the related mathematical concepts. So again, if you think of a Venn diagram, right, you have your student work right here, you're always including that. You have your mathematical concept that you're talking about. So if it's procedural knowledge, that's the other part of the Venn diagram. And then you have your commentary, right? All those things, your analysis, all those things need to be included in the way that you describe that in your commentary. So you always have to connect the student work, what the prompt is asking about, the mathematical concept, and then of course, how you're thinking about that. So you always include all those parts and cite exactly where the scorer can find that. So level 5 says analysis includes explicit connection between the identified area of struggle and underlying mathematical understanding and misconceptions. So again, as I mentioned before, you want to directly connect that student work to the mathematical concept, okay? You're always making those connections. Okay, any questions? Okay, where are we? Sorry, I'm going a little bit longer than I had planned. Okay, so number 3 says developing students' mathematical understandings. A, based on your analysis of the focus students' work samples, write a targeted learning objective goal for the students related to the area of struggle. So because you found 3 work samples that had a similar struggle, that was kind of spread across all your students, you're going to write a learning objective specifically for that issue, right? And then in B, it says, describe the re-engagement lesson you designed to develop each focus student's mathematical knowledge in relation to the targeted learning objective. Your description should include the targeted learning objective, the academic standards, and then the strategies and learning tasks to re-engage the students, including what you and your students will be doing. So you identify that issue, you write a new learning objective specifically for that, and then you describe the lesson that you created for that, right? So you're not including the whole lesson plan here, you're just describing it, okay? So the lesson learning objective is, these are the state standards that it aligns with, and these are the strategies that I'm going to implement. The students are going to work in small groups, they're going to work with manipulatives, or whatever it is they're going to do, right? It should all align to your new learning objective. And again, it shouldn't be exactly the same lesson plan or the same thing that you did in the lesson plan where they had issues. You want to think about ways to re-engage the students in those concepts and procedures. Representations and other instructional resource materials used to re-engage students. So what are some of the ways that you did it a little bit differently? And then what are the assessments for monitoring students learning during the lesson? So you want to demonstrate that as you were teaching, you were doing some sort of formative assessments. You were checking their understanding while they were working, okay? So that's your re-engagement lesson. We see here that it says, before responding to prompt 4, you will teach your re-engagement lesson. The lesson may be taught with the 3 focus students one-on-one, in a small group, or with the whole class. So however you want to do that is up to you. All 3 are acceptable here. And then 4 here says analyzing teaching. Let me see the rubric. Okay, yeah, I've got to read this one first. Okay, so analyzing teaching, we have that you need to cite the evidence from the 3 focus student work samples from the re-engagement lesson to support your responses for these prompts here. So again, citing the evidence means that you have those student work samples. Okay. So A says, in what form did you submit the 3 student work samples? Again, just a quick response to that. B says, analyze the effectiveness of the strategies you use during the re-engagement lesson to develop students' mathematical understandings in the identified area of struggle. And you see there it says, consider the change in students' mathematical understanding or misconceptions in relation to the identified area of struggle when describing the effectiveness of the re-engagement lesson. So now you're going to describe how the students came to understand what you were teaching based on these new strategies and this targeted lesson plan that you created. So, you know, you just talk through the student's work, right? You always want to cite exactly what you're talking about. So we see in student sample 1 that the student had a misunderstanding previous, and then these strategies were used. We had the students practice this. I engaged the students like this. And now you see that student 1 is able to work through it properly, or the misconception that was there isn't, or whatever it is, right? So you're describing the student work and what you did and how that affected their understanding for the better, I hope. And then C, in a video or audio work sample, if a video or audio work sample occurs in a group context, like a discussion, again, you just want to make sure you identify your students that you're using, okay? So for this analyzing teaching, you only want to focus on those 3 students, okay? Even if you include the whole class in this re-engagement lesson, you're just writing about those 3 students and uploading their work samples. Okay. And that aligns with rubric 18, using evidence to reflect on teaching. How does the candidate examine the re-engagement lesson to further student learning? Okay, so level 1, the things we don't want to do, says candidate states whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective without providing evidence from student work samples. So you don't want to just say it's effective and leave it at that, right? Or the candidate cites as evidence of student learning does not align with the student work samples. Again, make sure you include samples that you're talking about. Or targeted learning objective goal is not aligned with the identified area of struggle. Okay, so remember, based on your analysis, you identified this one area of struggle. So if your analysis went well and everything else, led you to this conclusion and that's all good, make sure that's what you're focused on in the re-engagement lesson, right? Don't go focusing on something else. Make sure it's aligned there. Level 2 says candidate states whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective and provides superficial evidence of student work samples. Okay, so that word superficial is important because you might have included work samples, but if they didn't really show anything, then you're gonna get a 2. They see that you did the lesson, they see that you had submitted work samples, but if there's no substantial explanation there or alignment, then you're gonna get a 2 and that's not passing. So we want to go at least up to 3. We're striving for 5, right? But let's look at 3. Level 3 says candidate uses evidence of student learning from the 3 student work samples to describe whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective. So again, always going back to that evidence, the student work samples. You want to describe whether it was effective or not, which is important because you want to talk about, again, both what the students did right or wrong on this assessment that you're talking about, okay? And so if you see that students are still having trouble, then you talk about that. Okay, the scorers don't care if, I'm sure they care, but they're not looking to see that now your students fully understand this concept and are never gonna have trouble with it again. They want to see that you're being reflective on what's happening with the teaching and learning between you and your students. Okay, so if you describe, don't try to hide it and say, the students didn't, the lesson wasn't effective, and so I don't have anything to talk about. You still need to talk about what was happening there. Okay, so the more clearly you reflect and you explain what happened, you'll be fine. The scores aren't going to knock points off if the students didn't learn, right? They want to know that you did everything you could at this point. Your instructional, strategies aligned with your learning objective, and you thought this was going to be helpful, and then you talk about why it was or wasn't. Okay, so either way, it's important to describe that. So don't not be thorough just because you think the students didn't quite get to where you wanted them to be. Okay. Level 4 says candidate uses specific evidence of student learning from the 3 student work samples to evaluate whether or not the re-engagement strategy was effective. So that's what I was saying. You want to say at a level 3 that it was effective or not, right? Level 4 is that explanation of why, both ways, whether it was effective or whether it wasn't. But you want to evaluate and describe why that was, okay? And that will bump you up to level 4. That plus this other stuff here in level 5 will get you to a 5. Candidate analyzes the change in student mathematical understanding or misconception using evidence from the re-engagement lesson. So, you describe whether it was effective or not. You evaluate what's going on there, and you point to specific work on the students' assessments where it says uses specific evidence. And then up to the level 5, you're directly connecting what the students demonstrated on the assessment to your instructional strategies now, okay? So you could say something like, in student work sample 1, I see that in assessment items 1 through 3, the students were using the strategy, the student was using the strategy that I used in the re-engagement lesson. And then you talk about the re-engagement lesson, right? Which you should already have described. And you make those connections there. How your engagement lesson specifically led to your students' understanding of this thing, right? Or misconception, okay? If you notice that they were still misunderstanding something, and you see that in your lesson, that that's what led to it, then make those connections, okay? Again, if you made a mistake, you still want to talk about what happened there, right? Because that's being a reflective practitioner, and that's what this test is about, is what kind of teacher are you going to be? This task is really checking to see if you're a reflective practitioner. Are you using this curriculum, instruction, assessment cycle to continually work to help your students? It is a cycle, and that's what they emphasize, and that's why this reflection is very important, because they want to see that you're using the data from your assessment and your assessment analysis to help the students continue to work towards those goals, okay? So make sure you're being reflective there. That's the important point. Okay. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions, open up now.
Thank you, Dr. Kulago. That was great. Really good to see how the formative assessments and the reteaching is a big part of the elementary edTPA task. Did anybody have anything about task 4 that they wanted to ask Dr. Kulago, or if you had another question about something else? You know, if Cassie, you had any extra questions about your edTPA that you wanted to ask Dr. Kulago?
I think you already answered all my questions, because like you said, it's very similar. So I think you answered everything that I was wondering about.
Great.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Kulago, for visiting with us. Very nice.
Nice to see you all.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm sad we can't all be together, I have to say. All right. So I'm going to stop the recording now.